John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the youngest man ever elected to the presidency, a war hero, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, a beacon of hope at a time when the world teetered on the edge of chaos. To millions, he wasn't just a politician. He was a symbol of progress, of youth, of what America could be. He gave the country something rare, belief that democracy could be elegant, that leadership could be graceful, that power could be compassionate. In the glow of the television age, he brought style to the White House. His speeches stirred the soul. His charm captivated the world, and his call for a new frontier promised to lead the nation into the stars, beyond segregation and toward peace. To some, he was a hero, bold enough to stare down nuclear annihilation in the Cuban Missile Crisis, brave enough to challenge civil injustice, visionary enough to declare that America would land a man on the moon. But to others, JFK was a riddle, a leader cloaked in charisma, whose charm masked complexity. Behind the curtain were secrets, personal struggles with chronic illness, political maneuvering born in smoky backrooms, affairs that threatened to unravel his image, and a nation pushed into the shadows of covert wars and intelligence games. He inspired with poetry, but governed in prose. His life, a contrast of soaring ideals and sharp realism. And then, November 22nd, 1963, a gunshot in Dallas, a motorcade soaked in confusion and blood, a nation stunned into silence. In that moment, history broke. The dream of Camelot shattered, and yet the questions have never stopped. Who really was John F. Kennedy? The idealist? The strategist? The martyr? Or something far more complex? This isn't just a story about a president. It's a story of image versus reality, of hope and contradiction, of light and shadow. This is the story of John F. Kennedy, the man, the myth, and the truth behind the legacy. The story of JFK doesn't begin in politics. It begins in privilege, in the wealth-lined halls of a powerful American dynasty. He was born on May 29th, 1917, in Brookline, Massachusetts, the second son of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy. His father was a towering figure in American finance and politics. Ambitious, driven, and calculating, Joe Kennedy had one goal: to create a legacy that would outlast him. And he intended to do it through his children. The Kennedy household wasn't just large, it was intense. 9 siblings raised in a strict Catholic home where discipline was absolute, appearances were everything, and competition was the family language. At the center of it all stood the patriarch, Joe Sr., who preached winning above all else. From the start, John, or Jack, as everyone called him, was the wild card, where his older brother Joe Jr. was the golden child, the model student and heir apparent. Jack was the sickly one, frail, often bedridden, and plagued by illnesses that would follow him all his life. Scarlet fever, colitis, and a back condition that would become crippling. Doctors warned he might not live to adulthood. But Jack wasn't one to accept limits. While illness made him introspective, it also gave him grit and time to read. History, literature, politics, these became his world when the outside one was off limits. Where Joe Jr. sought his father's approval with discipline and physical dominance, Jack developed charm. He learned to use humor as a shield, wit as a weapon, and curiosity as a compass. And despite the constant competition, he paid close attention to his brother. The way Joe Jr. carried himself, how he talked about duty, leadership, and legacy. In many ways, Jack was never supposed to be the one. His future, as imagined by his father, was a quiet one: law, maybe business. Joe Jr. was the chosen one, groomed for the presidency from the moment he could walk. But fate has a way of rewriting scripts. Jack followed in Joe Jr.'s footsteps to Harvard, and though his health often forced him out of class and into the infirmary, his intellect left a mark. He was deeply curious about how power functioned, not just in America, but around the world. It was during these years that he traveled across Europe, witnessing firsthand the rise of fascism, the failure of appeasement, and the drift toward war. His senior thesis, Why England Slept, analyzed Britain's unpreparedness for World War II. It was published and became a bestseller, a rare feat for a 22-year-old college student. Jack was starting to find his voice. Soft-spoken but sharp, unsure but determined. In his writing and reflection, one thing became clear. He had questions that couldn't be answered from the sidelines. He wasn't content to watch history. He wanted to shape it. Still, his ambitions were quiet then, more curiosity than crusade. In the eyes of his father, Jack remained second to Joe Jr., who was now training to be a Navy pilot. But everything changed in 1944. Joe Kennedy Jr. died in combat during a secret mission over Europe. His plane exploded midair. The tragedy shook the entire family to its core. But for Jack, it was more than personal grief. It was a pivot in the eyes of his father, and soon the torch had passed. The second son became the new hope, the reluctant prince, now expected to carry the banner forward. Joe Sr. turned his full attention to Jack, molding him for political life, opening doors, writing checks, pulling strings. But Jack wasn't just a name or a face. By this time, he had earned something more valuable than political connections. He had earned respect. In 1943, Kennedy's patrol boat, the PT-109, was struck by a Japanese destroyer in the Pacific. The collision tore the vessel in half and sent Jack and his crew into the ocean, stranded and surrounded by enemy forces. Despite his injured back, Kennedy swam for hours, pulling a wounded crewmate by his life jacket strap held in Jack's teeth. He led his men to safety over the next 6 days, a feat of courage that made headlines back home. For a nation at war, it was the kind of heroism America wanted to believe in. A Kennedy had bled for the country. Jack was no longer just a sickly intellectual. He was a war hero, humble, resilient, tested. And when he came home, limping, frail, but still smiling, America saw something they hadn't seen in decades. A young leader with charm, depth, and real battlefield scars. Joe Kennedy Sr. moved quickly. He saw the window, and he intended to open it wide. In 1946, just 2 years after his brother's death, Jack ran for Congress in Massachusetts' 11th District. Backed by his father's money and political savvy, and fueled by his war hero image, he won. At just 29, he was in Washington. But Jack wasn't satisfied with just being another congressman. His ambition, once dormant, was now fully awake. Despite constant health problems that left him hospitalized and in pain, he studied the game of politics with laser focus, observing power brokers, learning how deals were made and how narratives were shaped. He was charming but calculated, friendly but guarded, and always watching. In 1952, he set his sights higher. He challenged Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., a Republican heavyweight, for a U.S. Senate seat in Massachusetts. The odds were steep, but Kennedy had something his opponent didn't: a story, a narrative of service, sacrifice, and youth ready to lead a new era. With his sisters organizing grassroots campaigns, his family knocking on doors, and millions spent on advertisements, Kennedy won. And then, with the nation watching, he married Jacqueline Bouvier in 1953. The young, stylish couple captured the imagination of the country. They were America's royalty in the making. But behind the scenes, the cost was mounting. Jack's health deteriorated. He underwent multiple risky surgeries. At one point, he received the last rites, twice. Few knew the truth. To the public, he was healthy, vibrant, tireless. The mask had been perfected. He learned to hide pain behind poise, to deflect with humor, to seduce crowds while suffering in silence. Jack Kennedy had mastered not just politics, but performance. And as the 1950s drew to a close and television became the nation's new pulpit, he understood something most didn't. In the new America, image was power. The country was changing. Young people were restless. The old guard fell out of step. And somewhere deep inside, Jack Kennedy knew his moment was coming. By the time Jack Kennedy entered the U.S. Senate in 1953, he was no longer just another politician. He was a name, a brand, a symbol of something America hadn't felt in years: possibility. In the halls of power, he was still learning, observing how alliances were made, how legislation was shaped, and how influence could move mountains behind closed doors. But outside Washington, he was becoming something more: a rising star with a camera-ready smile and a natural instinct for connection. Kennedy's political rise wasn't just about policy. It was about presence. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room. He was often the one people remembered. He had an advantage few others could claim, a young, stylish wife who brought grace and culture to the public eye. Together, Jack and Jackie were captivating. They moved through ballrooms, rallies, and press circuits with ease. People didn't just support them. They followed them. They felt part of something new. And Jack understood something few others grasped at the time, that the story mattered as much as the substance. That perception was power. That the American people weren't just looking for leaders anymore. They were looking for icons. Behind the scenes, he kept building his machine. The Kennedy family name opened doors, and his father's fortune made sure none of them closed. Joe Sr. funded his campaigns, hired the best advisors, and placed loyalty above all. Jack wasn't just coasting on legacy. He was calculating every step. He chose his battles wisely in the Senate, speaking out on foreign policy, civil rights, and economic issues with a careful blend of conviction and caution. And as the Eisenhower era wore on, a growing number of Americans, especially the young, began to wonder if it was time for a new kind of leadership. By the late 1950s, that question was in the air, and Jack was ready with an answer. In 1960, at just 43 years old, he declared his candidacy for President of the United States. It was a bold move. He was young, relatively inexperienced, and a Catholic, in a country where no Catholic had ever been elected to the White House. Many believed his religion alone would cost him the race. But Jack didn't flinch. He took the attacks head-on. In speeches across the country, he confronted the issue with clarity and confidence, insisting that faith had no place in public office decisions. In doing so, he disarmed critics and turned suspicion into strength. Still, the path to the presidency wasn't smooth. His opponent, Vice President Richard Nixon, was no lightweight. He had experience, foreign policy credentials, and deep ties in Washington. Most pundits gave Nixon the edge. But then came the moment that changed everything: the televised presidential debates. For the first time in history, American voters could watch the candidates, side by side, live and unfiltered. What they saw was stark. Nixon, pale and tense, sweat glistening on his upper lip, looked worn and defensive. Kennedy, tan, calm, and confident, looked like the future. He didn't just speak well, he connected. Through the screen, he seemed to speak directly to viewers, not at them. Those who heard the debate on the radio thought Nixon held his own. However, those who watched it on television overwhelmingly declared Kennedy the winner. It was a defining moment in modern politics, the dawn of the media age, and Kennedy owned it. He barnstormed the country, visiting every state, shaking thousands of hands, delivering speeches with a mix of idealism and urgency. His campaign was lean, fast, and strategic, aimed at energizing the young, the working class, and those tired of Cold War stagnation. And on November 8, 1960, after one of the closest elections in American history, John F. Kennedy emerged victorious. He had won the Electoral College by a healthy margin. But the popular vote told a different story. He beat Nixon by less than 120,000 votes nationwide. It was a razor-thin edge, showing how divided the country truly was. But none of that mattered on Inauguration Day. On January 20th, 1961, under a clear winter sky, John F. Kennedy took the oath of office and became the 35th President of the United States, the youngest elected president, the first Catholic. A new era had begun. His speech, now etched in the fabric of American memory, rang out like a call to arms. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. It wasn't just a phrase. It was a mission. To millions of Americans, Kennedy represented hope, vigor, and change. To the world, he was a symbol of a youthful America, bold, brilliant, and idealistic. However, beneath the elegance and promise, the world was shifting, and the weight of the presidency, with all its secrets, pressures, and perils, was just beginning to press down. The golden boy had made it to the top, but staying there would test him in ways no one could imagine. The presidency of John F. Kennedy began with a jolt of energy, a flash of youth and confidence that seemed to electrify a weary nation. He called it the new frontier, a vision for America not defined by what it was, but by what it could become. The message was clear: a nation built on courage, sacrifice, and restless hope. And under Kennedy, America would push forward into space, into prosperity, into progress. But ambition has its cost. And beneath the sleek surface of Camelot, the challenges came fast, and they came hard. Kennedy knew that America stood at a crossroads. The post-war boom was fading. The country was growing, but unevenly. Racial tensions simmered beneath polite smiles, and a restless younger generation was beginning to question the promises of freedom they were taught in school. Kennedy's new frontier promised action on jobs, house education, and civil rights. But for all the soaring rhetoric, progress on the ground was slower, messier, more fragile. The economy was Kennedy's first test. He proposed tax cuts, investments in infrastructure and scientific innovation. His eye, always on the horizon, focused sharply on one goal: to win the space race. After the Soviet Union shocked the world by launching Sputnik, Kennedy pledged that America would not just catch up, it would lead. We choose to go to the moon, not because it is easy, but because it is hard. The line stirred a generation. It wasn't just about rockets. It was about proving something, that democracy could dream bigger, reach farther, and move faster than its rivals. But while NASA's engines roared toward the stars, another fight was brewing here on Earth. One Kennedy couldn't avoid much longer: civil rights. In the segregated South, buses burned, marches swelled, and black Americans demanded equality not tomorrow, but now. For months, Kennedy hesitated. His background was cautious, political. He worried that moving too fast on civil rights would alienate Southern Democrats and cost him re-election. But history has a way of forcing moments. Images of police dogs attacking peaceful protesters in Birmingham, of water cannons knocking children off their feet, of freedom riders beaten bloody on the side of American roads. The pressure mounted. His brother, Robert, now Attorney General, pushed harder, and slowly, JFK's voice grew stronger. He went on national television and made a moral plea, declaring civil rights a national crisis, not just a legal issue, but a matter of conscience. It was a turning point. For many, Kennedy had finally chosen a side. For others, it wasn't fast enough. In truth, he was steering a country on the edge between its ideals and its realities. And as he pushed forward domestically, the world outside America's borders was already catching fire. Barely 3 months into his presidency, he faced his first international disaster. The plan had been set in motion under Eisenhower, a covert CIA plot to overthrow Fidel Castro by arming Cuban exiles and sending them ashore at the Bay of Pigs. Kennedy gave the green light. What followed was catastrophe. The exiles landed, but the Cuban people didn't rise in rebellion. Castro's forces responded swiftly. The invasion failed within days, and dozens were captured or killed. The CIA begged for air support. Kennedy, fearing open war with the Soviets, refused. He was humiliated, not just in the eyes of the world, but in his own. He took full responsibility on national television, but behind the scenes, he was furious at the intelligence failures, at his advisors, at himself. The message to the world was clear. America, under Kennedy, had stumbled, and its enemies were watching. None more so than Nikita Khrushchev. That summer, in Vienna, Kennedy met the Soviet premier face-to-face. It was tense, cold, and combative. Khrushchev believed Kennedy was weak, a boy playing statesman. He pressed him hard, mocking American resolve, pushing the limits. Soon after, the Soviets built a wall across Berlin, dividing east from west, sealing in an entire population with barbed wire and concrete. The world watched in silence. Kennedy responded with troops, speeches, and strategy. But the game had changed. The Cold War was no longer about ideology. It was a chess match, and the board spanned the entire globe. In Southeast Asia, the seeds of a deeper war were already being planted. Vietnam was unstable, fragile, and leaning into chaos. Kennedy increased American advisors on the ground, not soldiers, officially, but the line was blurring fast. He didn't want war, but he also didn't want to lose another country to communism. And so, the quiet escalation began. But it was in October of 1962 that Kennedy faced his greatest test, one that brought the world as close to nuclear destruction as it has ever come. U.S. reconnaissance planes captured chilling images. Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. The threat was immediate. If those missiles became operational, the Soviets could strike nearly every American city in under 5 minutes. The military urged airstrikes. The CIA pushed for an invasion, but Kennedy held back. Instead, he announced a naval blockade, a quarantine around Cuba. No Soviet ship carrying weapons would be allowed through. The world held its breath. For 13 days, the standoff deepened. Soviet ships sailed toward the blockade line. U.S. forces were at DEFCON 2, one step from nuclear war. In the Pentagon, generals prepped for invasion. In schools across America, children practiced duck-and-cover drills. But Kennedy played a different game. Behind the scenes, he and Khrushchev exchanged private messages. Calm, cautious, and strategic. They each knew what was at stake, not just their own countries, but human civilization itself. In the end, a deal was struck. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba. In return, the U.S. would secretly agree to withdraw its missiles from Turkey, a concession kept hidden from the public. The crisis passed. War was averted. And JFK emerged as a hero, cool under pressure, firm but not reckless. The world exhaled. But the lesson was clear. One wrong move, one misread signal, and everything could vanish in a flash. Kennedy had stared down the abyss and pulled the world back from the edge. But the cost of that kind of leadership, the weight of every decision, the threat behind every smile, was beginning to take its toll. And as the public applauded the man who had kept them safe, darker forces were beginning to stir beneath the polished surface of the Kennedy White House. The Cold War wasn't just fought with armies and missiles. It was fought in backrooms and dark alleys, through spies, coups, and covert operations. And Kennedy, whether by choice or by inheritance, was deep in the game. He inherited a powerful but unruly CIA, a secretive agency that answered to no one but itself. After the embarrassment of the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy didn't just distrust the agency. He wanted to dismantle it. He famously said he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. But instead of cutting ties, he found himself tangled in even deeper. Throughout Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Africa, the CIA operated with brutal efficiency, toppling governments, backing rebels, funding dictators, all in the name of stopping communism. Some of these operations had Kennedy's blessing. Others were already in motion before he arrived. He wasn't always in control. Sometimes he was barely in the loop, but the consequences, he knew, would fall on him. And then there were the domestic shadows. Rumors swirled of Kennedy's ties, indirect or otherwise, to organized crime. His father, Joe Sr., was known and made alliances during Prohibition with certain figures to build a family fortune and influence. Some whispered that mob connections helped swing key Union votes in the 1960 election, especially in places like Illinois and West Virginia. At the same time, Bobby Kennedy, as Attorney General, was cracking down hard on the very same mafia figures. It was a dangerous contradiction. One brother suspected of owing favors, the other hell-bent on cleaning house. It wasn't just enemies who were watching. It was former allies, men who didn't forgive betrayal. And behind the walls of the White House, the president himself was becoming harder to read. His health, long hidden from the public, was in steep decline. He suffered from chronic back pain, Addison's disease, and was dependent on a cocktail of painkillers, stimulants, and steroids. Few outside his inner circle knew the truth. His charm remained intact, but the strain was growing. And then there were the women. Kennedy's appetite was legendary and dangerous. He was known to sneak away from official duties for secret rendezvous, sometimes with White House staffers, sometimes with socialites, and sometimes with women whose connections went far deeper. The most famous and most tragic was Marilyn Monroe. She was more than just a bombshell in a white dress. Marilyn embodied the fantasies of an entire era. Hollywood's golden girl, a voice like silk, a smile that could stop time, and a sadness she never quite escaped. Behind the cameras, she was emotionally fragile, dependent on pills, desperate for love and stability. She moved in elite circles, producers, politicians, power brokers. And somewhere along the way, she got too close to the wrong power. Her connection to JFK wasn't just rumor, it was electricity. Friends whispered of late-night calls, secret visits, glimpses of her name scribbled on presidential call logs under pseudonyms. Some say she believed it was more than a fling, that she was special, that he might even leave Jackie for her. But JFK was never one to mix power with permanence. And soon, she found herself drifting into the orbit of his younger brother, Robert, the Attorney General. The line between the brothers blurred, and so did the intentions. Her infamous serenade, "Happy Birthday, Mr. President," at Madison Square Garden in May 1962 sent shockwaves through Washington. She appeared in a skin-tight, flesh-colored dress, sewn onto her body, and whispered the words in a sultry tone that left no doubt. This wasn't just a birthday greeting. It was a message to the world and to Jackie. The First Lady didn't attend. After that night, the Kennedys began distancing themselves from Maryland. The calls stopped. The invitations vanished. And Monroe, already fragile, already unraveling, was left humiliated, angry, and alone. She told friends she was writing things down, that she was going to tell her story, the story in her own words. A tell-all, a book, less than 3 months later. August 5th, 1962. Her body was found face down, nude, clutching a telephone, as if she'd been trying to call for help. The official report called it probable suicide from an overdose of barbiturates. But those close to her, housekeepers, friends, even her psychiatrist, said she seemed hopeful that weekend, reconnecting, planning, waiting on a call from Bobby. Some said Bobby had visited her the night she died. Others claimed that her bedroom had been cleaned before the police arrived, that the number to the Justice Department had been written on a notepad by her bed, that the CIA and FBI had both opened classified files within hours of her death. No sign of the red diary she was rumored to have kept, the one filled with names, details, pillow talk, nuclear secrets. It was just gone. So was the tape recording system she reportedly had installed to capture late-night calls. Too many coincidences. Too many people too eager to move on. To the public, it was a tragic end to a troubled star. To those who understood the undercurrents of power, it was a message. Some believed she had been silenced. The press focused on the tragedy. But in back channels and briefcases, something else was circulating. Fear. If she could be silenced, who else could? And if Marilyn Monroe, Hollywood's brightest light, could vanish so suddenly, so completely, then the world would never see the Kennedy presidency the same way again. Some believed she knew too much about the president, about his brother, about what was said in pillow talk between a starlet and the most powerful men in America. And if she knew, who else did? The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, kept detailed files on Kennedy. Wiretaps, surveillance, records of visits and calls. Hoover didn't trust the Kennedys, and he made sure they knew it. His files were a silent threat, an insurance policy that made even presidents tread carefully. The White House, for all its elegance, was under a microscope, and within its walls, a man was carrying more than the weight of the world. He was juggling alliances and vendettas, ideals and compromises, love and loyalty, all while knowing that one wrong step could bring it crashing down. The American people saw the leader, the visionary, the family man. But behind the curtains in the quiet halls where power is whispered, John F. Kennedy was something else, a man at war with history, with his enemies, and with himself. He had survived political assassinations of character, military disasters, nuclear standoffs, and scandalous secrets. But some wars he would not win. And as the second year of his presidency came to a close, the shadows were getting longer. The forces that surrounded him, both loyal and hostile, were closing in. He had conquered perception. He had stared down the Kremlin. He had become the face of an ideal. But he was also walking through a minefield, and he would not reach the other side. November 22nd, 1963. A bright Texas sky stretched over Dallas, cloudless and sharp. The motorcade glided through city streets, cheered by crowds packed along sidewalks and leaning from balconies. Flashbulbs popped. Children waved flags. A president, youthful, handsome, sat atop the back seat of an open-top Lincoln Continental, smiling with charm. Jacqueline Kennedy sat poised beside him in her pink Chanel suit, matching pillbox hat tilted just so, her gloved hand rising and falling like royalty in a pageant. The air buzzed with more than celebration. It buzzed with faith, with reverence. For many Americans, this wasn't just a president. It was hope on wheels. But beneath the fanfare, a current of tension hummed quietly. Dallas, that day, was a city divided. Some called it the city of hate, a stronghold of right-wing hostility toward Kennedy. That morning, flyers accusing him of treason circulated downtown. A Dallas Morning News editorial blasted his policies. Protesters lined the route, silent, watchful, unwelcoming. And yet, despite warnings, the Secret Service opted for minimal precautions. The bulletproof bubble top was left behind. The motorcade's route made public in advance, included awkward, slow turns that would force the limousine to almost crawl at times. There were gaps in rooftops coverage. Radios crackled, but there was no urgency. No one imagined danger in daylight. At 12:29 p.m., the motorcade turned off Houston Street onto Elm, entering Dealey Plaza, a strange corner downtown where old met new. On one side stood the red brick Texas School Book Depository. On the other, a grassy slope, a picket fence, families waving. From above, it was a perfect vantage point. But from the street, just another cheering crowd. The president raised his hand. Jackie smiled. Then, 1 minute later, everything changed. Bang! A sharp crack rang out. Most thought it was a firecracker. The president turned slightly. Bang! A second shot, unmistakable this time. Chaos in the car. Jackie leaned toward her husband. Bang! The third bullet was the one seared into history. It struck JFK in the head, exploding into a cloud of red. His body lurched. His wife, stunned, scrambled across the trunk, not away, but toward the fragments of her husband's skull. A haunting, primal act of desperation. The motorcade sped away, sirens howling. At 12:36 p.m., John Fitzgerald Kennedy was declared dead at Parkland Memorial Hospital. The United States had never seen death like this. Not live, not in color, not to a man so beloved and young. It wasn't just the president who died that day. It was the illusion of American invincibility. Among the crowd that day, near the grassy knoll, was a man named Abraham Zapruder. He stood with his secretary beside him. He was not a journalist. He was not an investigator. He was a dressmaker, a local businessman. He almost left his Bell and Howell camera at home. But the idea of filming the president in color made him bring it along. He had no idea what he was about to capture. Standing on a concrete pedestal, Zapruder pressed a shutter as the motorcade approached. The camera made a soft whirring sound. Through the lens, it looked like a celebration. The president and first lady. A cheering crowd. Bright sunshine. But just 26 seconds later, everything changed. The Zapruder film became a symbol of national trauma. Frame by frame, it showed more than a murder. It showed the moment a country lost its innocence. The limousine moved forward. The president's body suddenly stiffened. His head snapped backward. Jackie climbed onto the trunk of the car. It looked like she was chasing something, or trying to escape. Behind them, Secret Service agent Clint Hill ran toward the car. No one knew what was happening, only that something terrible had occurred. Hill jumped onto the car. He pushed Jackie down and covered her with his body. In that moment, the dream ended. The film became a national obsession. Life magazine bought the rights. Only a few frames were published. The rest was hidden from the public. It was considered too disturbing. Years later, when the full footage was shown, the reaction changed again. It did not just look like an assassination. It looked like an execution. Sirens filled the plaza. Police ran in all directions. Witnesses shouted and pointed toward buildings and fences. Officers rushed to the Texas School Book Depository. Inside, the search was intense. On the 6th floor, they found a sniper's nest. Cardboard boxes were stacked near a window. Shell casings were on the floor. The window had a clear view of Elm Street. Nearby, they found the rifle. It was an Italian bolt-action Carcano. It was not designed for precision. It was not meant to kill a world leader. But it did. By 1:50 p.m., police had a name. Lee Harvey Oswald, a former Marine, a defector to the Soviet Union, a factory worker. He was not arrested for killing the president. At first, he was stopped for acting suspiciously. Then, in a quiet neighborhood, he shot Officer J.D. Tippit. That shooting put him in custody. Later, the pieces pointed back to Dealey Plaza. Oswald said he was innocent. In the police station, surrounded by reporters, he said, "I didn't shoot anybody. I'm just a patsy." The word stayed with people. To some, it sounded like the only truth they had heard all day. But Oswald never told his full story. He never got the chance. 2 days later, it happened again. This time, in the basement of police headquarters. At 11:21 a.m., while being moved to the county jail, a man in a black suit stepped forward. He pulled a gun from under his coat. Before anyone could react, he fired. One shot. Oswald fell. Reporters gasped. Police tackled the shooter. Chaos erupted. The man with the gun was Jack Ruby, a Dallas nightclub owner with mob ties, a love for attention, and a volatile temper. Ruby had no badge, no authorization. Yet somehow, he was there, within feet of the most high-profile suspect in the country. He told police he did it for Jackie, that he wanted to spare her the anguish of a public trial. But few believe him. Ruby wasn't just a nightclub owner. He had deep debts. He knew gangsters. His phone record showed a spike in calls to organized crime figures in the days leading up to the assassination. And yet, no one had stopped him. No one had checked his credentials. He simply walked in, pulled a gun, and executed the accused assassin. If Oswald had answers, they died with him on that basement floor. And for the American people, everything got murkier. The funeral of President Kennedy was watched by hundreds of millions. Horses pulled a flag-draped casket through Washington. The eternal flame was lit at Arlington. Dignitaries from around the world stood shoulder to shoulder. And at the edge of the ceremony, a small boy stepped forward. John F. Kennedy, Jr., just 3 years old, lifted his hand and saluted. It became the most haunting image of the century. The grief was vast, but in the shadows of the morning, doubt began to spread. Why had Oswald been able to escape the scene so easily? Why was the motorcade route public knowledge? Why had Ruby, with his long and questionable history, been able to walk in and shoot the only suspect? And what about the people on the grassy knoll? Multiple witnesses said they heard shots from that direction, not the depository. Some said they saw a puff of smoke. Others claimed they heard echoes that couldn't be explained by a single shooter. Yet those accounts were quietly pushed aside, dismissed as unreliable. Then came the magic bullet. According to the official investigation, later known as the Warren Commission, one bullet passed through Kennedy's back, exited his throat, entered Texas Governor John Connally's back, shattered a rib, exited his chest, entered his wrist, broke a bone, exited again, and lodged in his thigh, all without deforming significantly. To many, it wasn't just improbable. It was absurd. Ballistics experts raised their eyebrows. Physicists questioned the trajectory. Conspiracy theorists went into overdrive. If the magic bullet theory was a stretch, the alternative was chilling: more than one shooter. And if there was more than one shooter, there was a conspiracy. The Warren Commission, chaired by Chief Justice Earl Warren, was assembled with urgency. The goal: investigate the assassination and calm a grieving nation with facts, answers, and finality. But almost from the start, it seemed more concerned with preserving the public's trust than uncovering inconvenient truths. Members were selected not for their independence, but for their allegiance. Future President Gerald Ford, former CIA Director Allen Dulles, a man JFK had fired. Dulles, of all people, was now helping to shape the narrative of JFK's death. The conclusion they delivered in 1964 was simple. Too simple. Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. No evidence of conspiracy. No second shooter. Jack Ruby also acted alone, driven by emotion, not influence. The case was closed. But behind the scenes, the evidence was less tidy. Autopsy photos didn't match eyewitness accounts. Medical records were inconsistent. Witnesses who contradicted the official version, those who insisted they heard or saw shots from the front, from the knoll, were ignored or marginalized. Some even died mysteriously in the months and years that followed. A journalist researching the case was found dead with a gunshot wound to the head, ruled a suicide. A cab driver who gave Oswald a ride vanished. A witness who claimed to have seen armed men behind the fence at Dealey Plaza was found dead in her car, the engine still running. Coincidence? Maybe, but the pattern was hard to ignore. Then came the whispers, the ones that never went away, that Oswald had connections to intelligence agencies, that he'd been monitored long before the assassination, flagged as a volatile figure with Soviet sympathies, that he'd been seen in New Orleans passing out pro-Castro literature one week and meeting with anti-Castro exiles the next, that he wasn't a lone wolf, but a thread, one tangled in a web of Cold War espionage. Some claim the CIA had used Oswald as an asset, that he was part of a wider plan, perhaps even a failed plot to stage a fake attack to justify war. Others whispered of mafia involvement. The mob had once helped JFK win key states in the 1960 election, but his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, had aggressively prosecuted organized crime, a betrayal the mob wouldn't forget. And then there were the Cubans. After the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion, Kennedy had refused to provide air support to Cuban exiles, effectively dooming their mission to retake Cuba from Fidel Castro. Bitter, armed, and angry, many of these exiles held JFK personally responsible. Could they have plotted revenge? Even the Soviets weren't ruled out. After all, this was the height of the Cold War. Oswald had lived in the USSR, married a Russian woman, and had contacts at the Soviet embassy in Mexico City. Had he been turned? Was Dallas the KGB's revenge for the Cuban Missile Crisis? No theory could be confirmed, but none could be entirely dismissed. Jack Ruby, meanwhile, quickly fell apart in jail. At first confident, even cocky, he soon grew paranoid. He claimed he had been part of something larger, that Dallas wasn't safe, that the truth would never come out unless he was moved to Washington. He never was. Ruby's health deteriorated rapidly. In 1967, he died in a Dallas hospital from cancer, though some whispered that he had been silenced before he could say more. By the 1970s, public trust in government was eroding fast. Vietnam, Watergate, CIA scandals. The belief that officials would lie, cover up, or even kill to protect power had gone mainstream. The assassination no longer felt like a tragedy. It felt like a question mark that would never disappear. In 1976, Congress formed the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Their findings were explosive and largely buried. They concluded, after reviewing audio recordings and testimony, that there was a high probability that two gunmen fired at the president, that JFK was probably assassinated as a result of conspiracy. Yet no one was named, no one charged. They pointed vaguely toward unknown individuals. No agencies were blamed, no files fully released. The American public was handed half a truth and expected to move on. But the files told a different story. Classified for decades, many still remain sealed. The CIA, the FBI, the Secret Service, each has thousands of pages that, even today, have never seen the light of day. Presidents have promised transparency, yet redactions persist. Names blacked out, dates missing, pages simply gone. Why? Why, after all these years, is the truth still out of reach? What are they protecting? A name? A nation? Or the illusion that we've always known the full story? The Kennedy assassination wasn't just a political murder. It was a rupture in American identity. The moment the curtain was pulled back, and the machinery behind the dream was glimpsed. It marked the end of trust, the beginning of cynicism. It was, in many ways, the first American trauma to be experienced in real time. Television had become a national hearth. Families gathered around it not for entertainment that day, but for horror. Walter Cronkite's trembling voice. Live footage of Jackie arriving home in blood-stained clothes. Endless replays of the motorcade, of the gunshot, of the panic. It didn't feel like news. It felt like the loss of something sacred. For days, the country stood still. Schools closed. Churches opened. Strangers wept openly in the streets. Reporters broke down on air. A generation of children absorbed the moment not as an event, but as a psychic wound, one that would echo for decades. Because JFK wasn't just a president. He was a promise. The promise of Camelot, a land where youth, power, and hope ruled together. He was the embodiment of progress, of new beginnings, of the idea that America could lead not with might, but with vision. And in 10 seconds, it was gone. He was reduced to a Secret Service code word. Lancer is down. And something deeper was lost with him. The belief that we knew who ran our country. That election shaped our future. That power answered to people. In the years since, that belief has never fully returned. The questions have never stopped. They shift with each generation, but they're always there, whispered in books, forums, documentaries, on anniversary dates and faded newspaper pages. Who really pulled the trigger? Why did the government rush to close the case? And what truth lies buried beneath the layers of silence, secrecy, and fear? Because maybe in the end, it wasn't just about Kennedy. It was about us, about what we believe, about what we're allowed to know, about how history is shaped, not just by what happened, but by who tells the story. And in the story of JFK, the final chapter still hasn't been written. To understand the beginning of that chapter, to truly grasp the weight of that silence, that grief, that suspicion, we must look not at Dallas, but at Hyannisport, where an aging patriarch sat by the sea and said nothing. Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., father of 9, architect of a dynasty, and the man who spent his life building the road to the White House for one of his sons, was still alive when the news came, but he was no longer the towering force he once was. A massive stroke in 1961 had rendered him partially paralyzed and unable to speak. Still, he understood. He watched the coverage. He saw the flame. And those who were in the room say he wept, not just once, but often, not just for a son lost, but for a dream unraveled. The dream had been his. Joe Kennedy was no ordinary father. He had power, wealth, ambition so vast it seemed to echo through marble halls and private meetings alike. A ruthless businessman, a shrewd political player, and a man who believed deeply, perhaps obsessively, in legacy, in control. He had once wanted the presidency for himself, but controversy and scandal made that impossible. So he turned to his sons. First, Joseph Jr., handsome, smart, a war hero in the making. But Joe Jr. died in World War II in a fire explosion over the English Channel. That loss broke something in him and redirected everything toward his second son, Jack. JFK's rise wasn't just a story of charisma and charm. It was engineered down to the teeth. His smile, corrected with surgery. His war medals, promoted with press. His books, ghost-written and marketed. His campaigns, financed heavily by the family fortune, and, some whisper, through murkier means. Joseph Sr. pulled strings. He made deals. He brokered silence when needed. He met with Hollywood moguls, newspaper publishers, mob bosses, and politicians alike. He wasn't interested in fairness, only in results. And so when his golden boy finally became president, it wasn't just a victory for Jack. It was a coronation for Joe. But behind the family portraits and political speeches was a man with deep contradictions. He was anti-Semitic. He admired fascist regimes during the 1930s. He clashed with FDR and was removed as U.S. ambassador to Britain for defeatist rhetoric during the war. He operated with a moral compass that often pointed to whatever works. Was he proud of his son? Unquestionably. But was he capable of sacrificing others to protect that pride? That's where the shadows creep in. In the years since JFK's assassination, conspiracy theories haven't just pointed outward at the CIA, the mafia, or foreign powers. Some have turned inward toward the very family that seemed to have everything. There were whispers that Joe Sr. had ties too deep, that his old connections, forged in bootlegging, in banking, in Hollywood and Havana, may have created enemies or owed favors. Favors that came due when his son entered the Oval Office. Could his deals with the mob, back when he needed their help to secure Union votes in West Virginia and Chicago, have played a part? Did Jack's crackdown on organized crime through his brother Bobby's Justice Department betray those who once helped put him in power? And if so, did Joe know it would come back around? There's no proof, just silence. But silence can be loud. In the days after JFK's funeral, Joe Sr. sat in his wheelchair and stared at the television. He couldn't speak. He couldn't stop what had happened. But those around him described a man not just broken, but haunted. Some say he blamed himself, that his ambition had reached too far, that in trying to mold his son into a king, he had dragged him too close to the fire. Others say he never believed the official story, that when the Warren Commission report was released, Joseph Kennedy Sr. reportedly wept again. Not because it offered closure, but because it didn't offer truth. His last years were quiet, guarded by the family, surrounded by the weight of everything they had gained and lost. Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. died in 1969, 6 years after his son was killed. By then, before his death, another son, Robert, had also been gunned down. The dream was in ruins. Robert F. Kennedy wasn't just JFK's brother. He was his moral compass, his protector, his sword. After Jack's death, it was Bobby who bore the grief of a nation, who carried the weight of unfinished promises. At first, he stepped away, quiet, shattered. His voice slowed, his eyes dulled. Those who knew him said part of him died in Dallas too. But the fire didn't go out. By 1968, America was unraveling. Vietnam, riots, assassinations, distrust. Into that storm, Bobby stepped forward. Changed, humble, reluctant, but determined. He wasn't the ruthless attorney general anymore. He was a man who had walked through pain and emerged softer, deeper, a champion of the poor, the voiceless, the wounded soul of a country that no longer believed in heroes. He campaigned not on power, but on empathy. He went to Appalachia, to Watts, to reservations and tenements. He knelt with children. He listened. He cried. His speeches weren't polished performances. They were emotional excavations. And somehow, people began to hope again. They said he could unite what was broken. And on June 5, 1968, after winning the California primary, a critical victory in his run for president, Robert F. Kennedy stood before a roaring crowd at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, smiling, tired, grateful. Moments later, he walked to the hotel kitchen toward a waiting press conference. Then, a gun. Sirhan, a 24-year-old Palestinian, angry over RFK's support for Israel. He fired at close range. Chaos exploded in seconds. Bobby collapsed. Blood pooled on the white tile floor. A busboy named Juan Romero cradled his head. RFK looked up and whispered, "Is everybody okay?" It was his last act, concern for others. He died the next day. And the country broke again. 2 brothers, both assassinated, both buried near each other in Arlington. And at Hyannisport, their father watched. What must it have felt like to outlive not one, but 2 sons who had carried the hopes of millions? To sit in that wheelchair, trapped in silence, as the world replayed the tragedy you had spent your life trying to prevent, or, some would argue, help create? By the time Robert was laid to rest, Joseph Kennedy Sr. had become a ghost of himself, not just physically, but spiritually. The empire he built stood tall but hollow, a dynasty without its heirs. They had been his project, his mission, his legacy. Now they were gone. The headlines that once praised his brilliance now carried obituaries. And as reporters and historians tried to connect the dots between politics, power, and organized crime, between Cuba, the CIA, and conspiracy, the name Kennedy took on an almost Shakespearean weight. A name that once meant triumph now whispered tragedy. Joseph Kennedy Sr. remained behind closed doors. No interviews, no confessions, just the occasional photograph. Slumped in his chair, a shawl over his lap, eyes distant. Was he mourning? Regretting? Hiding? We don't know. Maybe we never will, but the silence spoke volumes. When he died in 1969, the world noted it quietly. There was no grand state funeral, no oration. His legacy had already been eclipsed by that of his sons, and the questions surrounding them. Yet behind every picture of Camelot, behind every campaign button, every iconic black and white photo of JFK in profile or Bobby in a crowd, the ghost of Joseph Kennedy Sr. lingers, the man who built it all, and then lived long enough to watch it fall. The true keeper of the flame, the last one standing when the music stopped, wasn't Joseph. It was Jackie, JFK's wife. Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy, America's eternal First Lady. She had once been the image of grace atop a White House balcony, hair swept by the breeze, children playing at her feet. To the world, she was elegance personified. But behind the smile was a woman forged in heartbreak. In Dallas, she lost her husband in the most violent way imaginable, not in the shadows, but beside her, in public, on a sunlit street. His blood soaked her pink Chanel suit. She refused to change it that day. She wanted the world to see what they had done. She stood beside Lyndon Johnson as he took the oath, her face blank, her body still trembling. And then, in the days that followed, amid chaos, conspiracy, and cameras, she became a pillar. She curated every detail of JFK's funeral. The procession, the riderless horse, the eternal flame. She drew parallels to Lincoln, to lost kings. She gave America a story it could live with, not just an assassination, but a myth, a tragedy worthy of a legend. It was Jackie who invoked Camelot. There will be great presidents again, she told Life magazine, but there will never be another Camelot. It was not a political statement. It was poetry, myth-making. History spun through the lens of loss. And then she vanished. In the years after Jack's death, Jackie retreated from the public eye. She raised her children in the protective shadow of Kennedy's legacy, determined to give them the privacy she never had. She was haunted by security lapses, stalked by the press, and burdened by a family name that had become a target. But fate wasn't done with her. In 1968, when Robert Kennedy was assassinated, Jackie's world cracked again. She had loved Bobby deeply, not romantically, but spiritually. He had been her rock after Jack, her friend, her fellow witness. When he died, she told friends, "If they're killing Kennedys, then my children are targets." She needed escape, not from grief, from the curse. And so, in a move that shocked the world, Jackie Kennedy married Aristotle Onassis, the Greek shipping magnate, a billionaire, a fortress. Some said she did it for money, others for protection. But the truth was simpler. She did it to disappear. As Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, she retreated into the shadows of global wealth, living aboard yachts and behind high gates. But the American press never stopped watching. Jackie O became a tabloid fixture. Cameras followed her everywhere, yet no one could quite reach her. She had become a symbol and a ghost, but time changed her. In the 1970s, after Onassis's death, Jackie came home, not to politics, but to publishing. She took a job as an editor at Viking Press, later Doubleday. No grand titles, no headlines, just manuscripts, red pens, and late nights. She worked hard, quietly. She edited books on dance, history, and art. One author said, she was meticulous, sharp, funny, tough. It was a version of Jackie the world never expected. Not a relic, but a woman rebuilding. And slowly, the public image softened. No longer just a grieving widow or the tragic icon. She became something richer, a survivor, a mother, a private woman with an extraordinary past, determined to carve an ordinary life. Her children, Caroline and John Jr., grew into their own. She guarded them fiercely. And when John Jr. became a media star in his own right, launching George magazine, he credited his mother for teaching him how to move through the fire without letting it burn him. In her final years, Jackie found peace. She walked the streets of New York in oversized sunglasses and turtlenecks, always just out of reach. She rode horses. She read obsessively. She adored ballet. She was no longer the First Lady of America. She was a citizen of the world. And perhaps, Finally, her own. In 1994, she was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. She told almost no one. Even in death, she controlled the narrative. On May 19, 1994, she died in her sleep at age 64, surrounded by her children. Her funeral was small, dignified, elegant. Just like her, she was buried beside John, beneath the eternal flame she had lit 3 decades earlier. And in that moment, something shifted in the American memory. She wasn't just a woman in the blood-stained suit anymore. She was the archivist of a dream, the mother of myth, the final witness to a golden moment that ended in gunfire. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis became what she had always been beneath the fame. Resilient, mysterious, unforgettable. She didn't just endure history. She helped write it. In the end, it wasn't just the bullets in Dallas that changed America. It was everything that followed. 1,000 questions, 1,000 shattered dreams, and the silence of a family who had lived too close to power and too close to fate. John F. Kennedy had arrived with the promise of youth, a torch passed to a new generation. He spoke of a world united, of a country unafraid, of reaching the moon and curing injustice. For a moment, Americans believed in something larger than politics. They believed in him. And when he fell, it wasn't just a man who was lost. It was a vision, a hope, a rhythm of possibility that never quite returned. But even tragedy, when carried with dignity, becomes legacy. His wife, once just a symbol, became a steward of memory. His brothers, one fell by an assassin's bullet, another by scandal and sorrow, tried to carry the weight, but none could bear it alone. The Kennedy name, once synonymous with glory, became marked by something else, loss. Like a Greek tragedy written in red, across decades and generations. But maybe that's what made the myth endure. Not perfection, but the pursuit of it. Not victory, but the courage to keep rising again and again, even when the gods seemed cruel. And so we remember JFK, not only for how he died, but for how he lived, for the lines he spoke that still echo, for the vision he shared that still matters, for the challenge he gave that still stands. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. A challenge not meant for a day, but for a lifetime. The eternal flame still burns at Arlington, but its real light lives on, not in marble or myth, but in memory. And maybe that's enough.